Once again, we're talking about Christmas with Brent and a little trip down Christmas history. Most of us are going to be familiar with St. Nick, and we're going to talk a little bit about the poem that brought St. Nick into America's consciousness, as well as the popular image. Let's start with the poem, A Visit from St. Nick. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, it was written by a college professor by the name of Clement Clarke Moore. And he was building on, 1,000 years of tradition of St. Nicholas, mostly British and Scandinavian tradition. But the Nicholas that he was writing about was a little different in his verses. His children wanted him to write a poem. And for Christmas in 1823, at Chelsea, New York, where he lived, he was a professor at Columbia University. He wrote this little poem, and it was called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And he put some elements in there that have become a real tradition over the years. It was first published in the Troy Sentinel newspaper, and then it was picked up by two periodicals. One of those, 1825, 2 years later for Christmas, was the United States National Almanac, which I'm holding. And in it, there, just without any author or anything like that, there's an account of a visit from St. Nicholas. It was the night before Christmas, went all through the house. A creature was stirring, not even a mouse, and so on. And it took off like wildfire. It didn't have Moore's name on it because he frankly didn't want his name on it. He had written this for his kids, and he thought that it was just for them. It was a private thing. It wasn't to be, the intent wasn't to publish it to the world, but it isn't amazing how it caught on and took off.
So how did his poem get to the world? If he wrote it for his kids, how did it find its way? Who leaked it, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, we're not exactly sure. Well, we think it was like a brother-in-law or a close relative that leaked it. They thought it was so good that they leaked it to the newspaper, and then it was picked up by a couple of periodicals. And then from then on, every year, would you please put in, and they didn't really know his name for a long time. It wasn't until 1837 that in this book, it was called the New York Book of Poetry, that came out quite a few years later, that for the first time had his name on it. There's A Visit from St. Nicholas by Clement C. Moore, it says. So this is the first publication that actually had his name on the thing. And then it was published again in 1840 in what was called the Poets of America Illustrated, this pretty book that came out of that time. And at this particular junction, they actually used a picture of what they perceived to be what he was writing about, kind of a new version of St. Nicholas. In this particular version, of course, he's smoking on a pipe, but it has his name by C.C. Moore. And then in 1844, Moore himself, who'd written other poems, decided, well, maybe it's time that I put out a little book of poetry. And so it was again published in this book. This particular copy is interesting because Moore inscribed it to a friend from the author in 1846, 2 years after it came out. Well, the little poem took off. Many illustrators got a hold of it. Here's one by E.O.C. Darley, who's one of the great Victorian illustrators. And on the back it's got Merry Christmas to All, but it's a visit from St. Nicholas, illustrated in drawings by F.O.C. Darley, who was one of the great illustrators of that time. I brought a letter of Moore's so you can see his handwriting. This would have been the handwriting, the original, which does exist in a couple of original copies in Moore's handwriting like this. And then it was copied in all kinds of ways. Here's a little early brochure, had the visit from St. Nicholas, and it's kind of a cute little thing. And there were later ones too that came out. This, for instance, is Thomas Nast's version of it, which we'll talk a little about Nast too for a minute or two.
I do have a question for you about
you
the perception of St. Nicholas. Was that a part of Christmas tradition prior to the publication of this poem, or did this help shape the way that that we celebrate, a visit from St. Nick?
Good question. This really shaped St. Nicholas. at least in a verbal way. And then artists went to work to try to, make the jolly old elf. And the idea of flying reindeer with Santa Claus, it's there have actually been some scientific studies on whether that's possible, and most aviation officials say that the thing would have burned up long before it got to all of those homes and so on one night. But, that's the joy of Christmas, is not worrying about the scientific realities. But the kids know it's possible, and NORAD every year tracks Santa,
That they do.
Yeah, so we know he's a real entity. And maybe this is a good time to talk a little about Thomas Nast.
Yeah, first of all, who was Thomas Nast?
Well, Thomas Nast was a German-born American cartoonist. He's considered the father of American cartooning, and probably the greatest cartoonist of early America. This is just an example of an original cartoon from our collection. This one has to do with someone not being seated in Congress by the name of George Q. Cannon, and the cannon went off. And so everything that he did was basically political cartooning, and so that's what he was trying to get across to people, is the idea that the cartoon could be used to make political statements. But it wasn't actually until he joined Harpers Weekly. Here's the year 1863 that I'm holding here in a volume, and Harpers had him as one of their great illustrators during the American Civil War. Here's the very first illustration that he ever did of Santa Claus, and it has to do with Union troops here participating, and here's Santa passing out gifts and so on. It was a political cartoon. If you'll notice, Santa has a little puppet on a string that looks very much like Jefferson Davis. Santa's wearing, a coat that has stars on it with stripes on his pants. We don't talk about that much anymore because the influence of his perception of what Santa was really caught on. And then, of course, the most famous illustration on Santa that really cemented his look was done by Nast in 1881. And we're all familiar with this. It was a double-page woodcut of Santa. And again, kind of interesting because it has a clock in here showing the time is 10 to 12. He actually put this in to try to get Congress to pass some legislation to help the veterans, and the troops, which he was very fond of helping. But that's kind of been lost, that part of it now. But his idea of Santa has evolved. It's also noted that it was Nast that created the Republican elephant, and he really had quite a bit to do with cementing the idea of the Democratic donkey too. But probably his most famous creation was Santa Claus. Here's a later Nast Santa that he did that you can see.
Brent, with the incredible detail in every one of these images, how long did it take him to do these images? Do we have any idea?
Well, yeah, some took several hours up to several days. Some of these big Civil War ones took several days for him to do them, even a week, and they're quite detailed, as you can tell.
Just to bring it around full circle too, these are amazing artifacts, but they still have something that has relevance in our day. What can we learn from them as we celebrate Christmas today?
Well, for one thing, Christmas should be a happy time. This is a jolly old elf, as Moore called him, and Nast helped bring that to life. And all of this stems back to the gift giving that was done at the time of the Christ child, which was Dickens' gift to the world in A Christmas Carol. The story that was really for kids of all ages. But, when you've got, Ebenezer Scrooge, humbug, and are there poorhouses and so on, the whole idea with Dickens and with these other Americans is to show that Christmas should be a happy time. It should be a time of giving. It should be a time for children. it should be a time to take care of those less fortunate.
Well, thanks for sharing these with us. That is more real history and more of the real story.